Our next speaker is as good as gold. Today, Liz Goodgold is going to speak to us regarding marketing. Liz is a trainer who is working on branding and how to speak gooder. Having delivered 348 presentations in the last 5 years, Liz knows what works and what doesn't. She's had the joy of falling off a stage, walking out of her shoe, a microphone exploding into fire, and snow falling on her head, with an earthquake interrupting one of her talks. She is the author of 3 books, has appeared on 2 TV shows, dishing out the dirt on celebrity branding. She has appeared on every single news channel, including NBC, ABC, PBS, and perhaps even PMS. So here to help us share the magic of storytelling, please help me welcome Liz Goodgold.
Well, thank you, George. Data strays, but stories stay. When an entrepreneur who was struggling in 1998 walked into a department store, her goal was simply the same as you and me: get the yes. But instead, she heard no after no after no. And she's wondering, when am I ever going to catch a break? Her mission was simple: how to sell her new product, which was a little bit of a hybrid of a new girdle meets modern technology. And buyer after buyer said no until she did 2 things. The first is she brought in a pair of pantyhose and cut off the feet. The second thing that she did is she modeled a pair of white pants before her garment and after her garment. Within 3 weeks of making that presentation to Neiman Marcus, her Spanx product was on shelf. Obviously, I am talking about Sarah Blakely. Data strays, but story stay. Sarah mentions that she has delivered this story over 2,000 times. It has garnered her publicity and, most important, funding, and both mind share and market share. So really, here's my question to all of you. Have you worked on your origin story? Do you really know how to tell the story? And do you know how to sell your story when it comes to the founding mission of your entrepreneurial venture? In the short time that we have today, we are going to be sharing all of the lessons you need to do a much better job when it comes to storytelling. Of course, the chat is open. Thank goodness Maggie will be over there because I cannot double task. I'm lucky I can do 1 thing instead of 2. So let's jump right into some of the key things that make for a phenomenal story. At the top of the list, believe it or not, I have to share, it has to be both honest and authentic. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but raise your hand in front of your screen if you're live, if you have heard the story that eBay was created to better buy and sell Pez dispensers. Well, I certainly have. And of course, we know that that story is false. So we know that there are beautiful, magnificent public relations machines who can't wait to churn out a story. But please don't let the need for a great story overwhelm your need for the truth. So the first rule, of course, is your story has to be true and it has to be authentic. Wozniak says today, for example, that they love the idea of HP starting in the garage. And that's why he started to really perpetuate that story as well, when that really isn't the truth. My second rule here, and even in the example, is that a founding story doesn't have to be about you. As much as I was tempted, I didn't tell the story about me. And I think there's a lot of founders who think, oh my gosh, I really don't have this great story. But here's the deal. Keep social listening. As you're inventing your product, as you're pitching your product, listen to what the people are telling you. There's a great company by the name of Fortified Bike Alliance. And they really didn't have a good origin story until one day his friend had his bike stolen. So Fortified Bike makes these really tough to steal bike lights. So this guy's friend's bike was stolen and it didn't have a bike light. And within 22 minutes, he was in a bicycle accident with a car. That is his story from now on. And you see, if we start applying, A, that's true. B, it can be about somebody else. And here's the third component of a great story. The third component of a great story is it has emotion. You care. You feel something. I mean, oh my gosh, you are selling a bike light that prevents accidents. And when the guy doesn't have it, boom, he gets hit by a car. That is powerful. So for people who have the chat and are with me, go ahead for me right now and write, is there an emotion right here in the chat? Say, give me an example of an emotion that you can share when talking about your product. Your emotion can be happiness. It can be fear of catching a disease, fear of dying. It can be fear of failure. We all know that negative emotions sell better than positive ones. Because go ahead.
DP wrote that he started his software company because nobody would hire him due to his age.
I think that's great. And I hope you might be in the Q&A later, because I'd love to hear how you really develop the story, because it can be tremendously compelling. I mean, I joke all the time, as a matter of fact, that my company's Redfire Branding, but it doesn't matter because I can never be Silverfire. Because the minute I'm silver, they're never going to hire me.
That's a good point. He is actually one of your guinea pig victims for
for
work.
Oh, good. So that makes me really excited. So yeah, really take a moment to think about it. And even if, of course, you can't do it on the fly, but you're taking some really good notes, think about what sort of emotion makes sense. As you start to tell a story, you have to think about all of your 5 senses. You're painting a picture. So I want to hear about what you saw, what you tasted, what someone else was saying. Tactily, could you feel it? The more that you involve the senses, the rule of thumb, by the way, in storytelling is that you always have to engage at least 2 senses, or you haven't told a story. You have told it, but you haven't sold it. So think about that. It's also the same reason when we talk, every time if you're doing a pitch, and I know it's so hard because it's often virtual today, that the more senses that you engage, you're more likelihood to get a yes. So if someone ever says to you, would you like a cup of coffee? Your answer is, of course you would, because you now have engaged another sense, which is taste, and the person is more likely to view that engagement as more memorable and more favorable. So think about that. Another great way to think about a story is statistics. Every story should have at least 1 statistic. Here's how another client of mine simply and elegantly explains her premise at the beginning of a talk. 43% of 2nd grade girls won't eat lunch today for the fear of getting fat. My mission is to change the body perception, and off she goes. You see, that's working, that just one really good statistic starts it and then enables you to really start layering in additional facts, figures, emotions, or whatever the heck it is that you're talking about.
Liz?
Yes,
George Cleve entered fear as one of the emotions that you can use. Can you give us an example of how to use fear in your story?
Sure. Give me something simple. I haven't had the chance to see the intro of what everybody is doing online. So if you want to suggest one, great. Otherwise, I'll invent one. I mean, let's just take something, make my life easy. Okay, let's say chiropractor. Okay. Do you fear looking like your grandmother? Are you afraid you're going to be huddled over? Are you afraid that the chair you're sitting in won't even hold you any longer? come bum bum. That can be really, really simple like that. Is that what you're asking?
That was correct.
Okay. So yeah, that's something that I always like to tap into. And it could be fear of failure, right? Especially if you're selling to other small business owners. The desire for success, either of those work really well. So we've talked about some things that really, really work when it comes to telling a story. Let me turn it over for just a moment and really share things that never work. So if you will, these are really the deadly sins of storytelling. And if you're taking notes, jot these ones down because these often are fatal flaws, especially when it comes to investing in your company. The first one is simply this: you are not allowed to become the hero of your own story. What I mean by that is you can't always have had, voila, the perfect idea. You can't always be the most brilliant person in the room. You can't be the one who swoops in to save the day. Let me give you an example. I have a client of mine who was so excited to work with me. And he says, oh my gosh, Liz, I have one amazing story that I tell every single time to my employees from the stage. And it's typically between 2,500 and 5,000 employees at the time, last year, obviously. And his story goes something like this. I am in the first class cabin of Cathay Pacific. And I sit down and the guy next to me is just annoying. And he's so frustrated because his computer console isn't working. And we're going to fly from Hong Kong to LAX. And he recognizes that he has 14 hours of dead air with no electronics that will work. So my client raises his hand and said, I have so much work to do that let me switch first class seats with you so that you can enjoy the great stereo movies on demand, and I will look at and sit in yours and I'll do working. And when he gets off the plane at LAX, executives and the pilot are waiting for him from Cathay Pacific, and they have a bottle of Vive Clicquot for him. They invite him into an executive lounge. They heap upon him a $500 gift certificate for being so kind for switching seats. And his point of the story is that it shows to be aware of the pain that other people are in to always do the right thing. So please, if anybody's listening here, would you type in the chat if you were as frustrated as I was when I heard that story and why you think that story fell on deaf ears for his employees? So obviously I'm seeing, right, how obnoxious.
Yeah,
And
there's no real point to his story. It's just how wonderful he is.
he's so wonderful.
annoying.
And then here's the point. And I've been, and I will not say this company name, but I am listening to him and I realize I'm like one of his employees. I would have been the one who was flying on Southwest. And he's talking about how great he is, that not only did he, oh, big deal. He switched one first class seat for another first class seat. He's not paying for the airfare to begin with. And then on top of that, he gets rewarded with a bottle of Vive Clicquot and a $500 gift certificate. And this is really important. So stories, not only you can't be the hero of your own story, right? Because he was swooping in and he's fabulous and he's brilliant. He also gave us a story that we can't relate to. There's a whole bunch of us who haven't and don't fly first class, who are thinking, well, lucky you, why didn't he just say thank you? So this is something really to remember, is when you're telling a story, you're trying to get it to be a little bit more universal. The standard bar here is talk about the toothpaste that you can't put back into the toothpaste, the genie that you can't put back. Think about things that people can relate to versus something that's so out of their league. I remember giving a speech in San Diego, and this presenter who followed me was so excited. And he started talking about, oh, he's so excited to be in San Diego because this is where he winters. And I stopped him afterwards. He's like, oh, Liz, I'm so excited to coach with you. And I'm like, no. I said, first of all, you cannot winter as a verb, especially when you're here, when people are thrilled to have one home and you're bragging when you're talking about that you have two homes and you summer somewhere different than where you winter. Is that making sense? So I see a little bit of chat. Thank you, Maggie, for sort of being my moderator here. I'm hopeful that that's making sense to folks, because it's a little weird one about this. You can't be the braggart and you can't be the hero of your own story. And yet at the same time, you want to tell stories that are interesting, but they still need to be relatable.
Yeah, I don't think anybody in this audience is a Cathay Pacific first class kind of person. Maybe they are.
No, and as you remember, I got invited to speak in Beijing, and I was offered either I could bring my mother with me and they would fly me coach, or I could go by myself first class Cathay Pacific. So obviously I chose coach so I could go with my mom.
Yeah, DP is saying that he's also in the cheap seats. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's just sort of the way it goes. Okay.
So why would somebody choose to tell this as a story? Why shouldn't it be more about the company and how the company helps?
Well, I think he was really trying to get the point that if you really listen and you pay attention to what other people are saying, this is your opportunity to swoop in and help them in terms of this high-tech company. That was his point. And he was trying to demonstrate that. Notice how even in this aircraft, I was observant and I was hearing what they were saying. And that's why I was able to switch. In his mind, he never thought it was obnoxious. And only afterwards he said, how come no one told me? And I pretty much said, because you're the CEO.
Yeah, you should know your audience and the position or the authority that you have over your audience.
Yeah, and this is what I always say. Also, fish don't see water, right? So he really couldn't see it. And this is one of my number one recommendations if you're working on your story. And that is not just practicing in your bedroom, because in my book, practicing by yourself doesn't work. You have to be in front of other people. So the best way to practice your story is to tell it to others without telling them that you're practicing. In other words, if you were meeting somebody for a glass of wine, oh yes, that sounds great, happy Friday, you would be able to sit and say, oh my gosh, and you go right into your story. So you haven't given it what I call that preface of, oh, I'm working on my story, can I tell it to you? Just tell it instead of asking for permission. And what I think happens this way is you get better and better at telling the story. And you see when people's eyes start to wander, you start to see if they are tuning you out. And here's something that's really important. You get to really notice if they laugh. And this relates to another point of mine. You never get to tell people how they're going to feel about your story. So in other words, you never get to say, oh my gosh, I have a funny story to tell you. You tell the story and you see if they're going to laugh. You tell the story and see if they laugh. You never judge your own story. So you never, oh, here's an interesting story. No, just tell the story. And I find if you're in a very social situation, in a small cocktail party, gosh willing, keep telling it till you get to the point where it's shorter, it's crisper, and you're getting the emotion and the reaction that you're looking for. And that's really when you know that you've hit a home run.
So what are some of the other don'ts?
Some more don'ts are, my number one is too long. And that is giving so much detail. So we're talking about stories, you need to paint a picture. And you literally, if you're judging, if you're good enough as your storyteller, is with good friends, people you love, know, and trust, start telling the story and ask if they can draw it. Have you been so clear that they could put the people or the clouds or the room or the rain or whatever it is that's really part of the story? But what I find is most people put in too much extraneous detail. So if you're telling the story about how you founded the company, it always makes sense to anchor it somehow. So you anchor it in a period of time, you anchor it in a place, but I don't need to know, unless you're going to tell me how poverty-stricken that you are, I don't need to know what that garage looked like. I don't need to know that it was concrete, that it was pale, that it was gray. I pretty much have got that. It's only relevant if you're telling me, here we were, we started at 6 a.m., we worked to 3 a.m. every single day. We couldn't afford heat. The room was concrete. We were always wearing a hoodie and fingerless gloves so we could work. That's how cold it was. Why? Because we couldn't afford heat. And then when we finally sold our first computer, that was life-changing. That's when we finally cashed our first $2,000 check. And that $2,000 check started the seed money for our company. Are you with me? So that's when you need the detail. But most people, if you start listening stories, any social situation even, and business, you will hear people give you way too much detail and it's not relevant.
Liz, Patty wants to know, what if you're an introvert? How can you share your story? Can you have someone else deliver your story?
Well, clearly I just told Sarah Blake's story, Blakely's story. So yes, it's possible. So if you are the introvert, you're going to have to find modes of communicating that make you comfortable. What do I mean by that? You can always be more comfortable on Zoom, perhaps, than standing in front of a few hundred people. So that's one simple way. You could record it better on an iPhone and then play that if that makes you more comfortable. You can write really good, compelling stories. You can blog about it. So find how you feel more comfortable.
Okay, but you can't take your written story to a party.
You can take a written story to a party. I was thinking about, she was talking about a pitch, right? So in other words, she could write it, she could blog it, she could record it on Zoom, all of those things. But if you're naturally an introvert, that's sort of at some point, even in groups, you're going to have to do it in small groups. So if you only feel comfortable on one-on-ones, well, guess what your whole business trajectory's got to be? You're going to be having a whole heck of a lot of one-on-one meetings, one-on-one coffees, one-on-one glasses of wine until you get just a little bit more comfortable. But to me, this is what it really brings up. And that is more of a fear of networking. And I don't know what to say, or I don't know how to say it.
So how do you train yourself? How do you get more comfortable?
Oh yeah. So here's my favorite. So this is what I always do is I keep a quip in my hip. What a surprise. I always have something to say. And gosh, it's so hard because we're not in good networking situations right now, but I think you have to do it on Zoom, which is you need to have the art of chit chat. But I like to take it to an extra level. And what I mean by that is I like to know what I'm going to say before I go. And I like to have something to say that's still relative to my business. So in other words, if I was meeting a business associate for a glass of wine or some small party, I could say, oh my God, how are you? And I could go and tell you something interesting, a little quip in my hip about my kid. Well, that's not really helping my business. But instead, it might be more interesting if I told a story about, oh my gosh, I'm so excited about going on radio next week. This is the first time I'm finally doing Reno radio and I'm sharing blah, 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 blah. So I have something to say, but it's also important and it's connected to my business.
We have another question. Do you have any examples of successful introverted company founders or leaders? Like you told Sarah Blakely's story, and I've seen her on Shark Tank, so she seems pretty comfortable now. Was she always comfortable, or do you have other examples?
I don't have people who started as introverts because by the time we usually hear about them, right, they've got really good at what they're doing. And I don't know if it's necessarily introverts, but what I can share are some just key principles of speaking that help people who are uncomfortable. And the first one really is, before you go, warm up your voice. So whether you're pitching in front of one person, going to an event, or there's an entire room, and this is really important, especially in the morning if you don't live with anybody, you will have that horrible morning voice. So my number one recommendation is to warm up your voice. And my favorite way to warm up your voice, if you don't know it, is Dr. Seuss. It is great. It's easy to find. And whether it's one fish, two fish, red fish, blue fish, it makes your mouth work. And if you get the cadence wrong, the rhymes no longer work. And it's an important element of speaking, which is you need a really good cadence. And I think people who keep practicing with their voice get more comfortable with their voice. So I think practicing makes a lot, warming up your voice, and then really looking at some vocal variety. And what I mean by that is really playing with pause, pace, volume, and repetition. So if you have an important point to make, it's perfectly acceptable, encouraged to repeat that point. Make sure people get it. I mean, this is a concept, obviously, that Martin Luther King perfected, right? I have a dream. I have a dream. I have a dream. It's actually called anaphora, is that means of doing that in a literary sense. So that's really important. And I think the more that you feel comfortable, getting your voice comfortable, making sure you don't have some of these sins when it comes to speaking. So in other words, you are not, the technical term is called disfluency. And what that means is you are putting some of those horrible fillers instead of speaking. So either your mind is ahead of you and you haven't caught up to your mouth, or your mouth is ahead of you and it hasn't caught up to your brain. But what it really means is to be comfortable with a little bit of silence. And I think that makes a whole heck of a lot of sense.
So is pausing part of cadence or is it part of pace? Because I don't understand the difference between the two, but it seems like it's kind of technical and I'm not sure anybody even cares.
Yeah, I don't care if you care or not, but what I do care is that you have the vocal variety, because let's put it the other way. If I want to tell you a story and my voice is like this and I continue to do it this way, what you have is the recipe for insomnia, because I will put you to sleep. So what I'm really trying to say is that the vocal variety, volume's going up, pitch sometimes is going up. I am pausing occasionally. I'm speeding up when I have something really interesting and exciting to tell, and other times I'm slowing it down. That's really all you need to know, is that you have to have vocal variety. If you keep at that same ugly, dull pace, you will put people to sleep. That's really what I'm trying to get. It's not so much that you have to be technical, it's that you have to embrace that variety. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, it does. Do you recommend Ogden Nash too, or is it just Dr. Seuss?
I don't care who you use, but I know about morning voice, and all of a sudden you get that horrible rasp and you keep trying to clear your throat. And by the way, if you keep trying to clear your throat, it usually gets worse and it just doesn't seem to get any better. And that's something that just drives me absolutely crazy.
Okay, so how much time does one spend warming up the voice? How long does that take?
It doesn't take long at all. I mean, I think you can really feel good and confident within 10 minutes. But I also go back to the person that you were telling me about, who really is that introvert, or you finally do have to speak in front of a group and you get a little bit nervous. To me, my favorite thing to do, and this is so often me, if you've ever seen me speak, if I'm behind a stage, I guarantee you that I am physically moving. I am doing a jumping jack. I am shaking it out. I'm doing all sorts of things because it sort of gets out all that nervous energy for me. And I do it before I go on TV or whatnot. So in other words, here's the camera. I'm over here, crazy, 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 getting it all out. They can't see me. They can't hear me. And therefore, I get that one great breath, and then I'm ready to go. And it's just impossible to be shaking and nervous after you are physically moving. And that makes me feel so much better, because I raise my hand and say, yep, I've done it a million times and I get nervous just a little bit every single time.
And then you just shake it out and everything's better.
Yeah, everything's better. I just shake it out and good, and I feel better and I'm ready to go.
Okay. Well, what about stumbling over your words? Is that really just a question of practice?
It's practice, and it's usually because you're too excited. Your brain is ahead of you, and that usually is the case of take a breath. But here's the most important part. Even in an investor pitch, or you're selling the idea, or you're in front of a million cups, it doesn't matter. Most people want you to succeed. And it's perfectly acceptable to say, whoops, I goofed that up. Whoops, I think I just lost myself. Give me a moment.
Oh, okay. So
It really, I can't tell. I mean, I was going on and on. I don't know. I was like a 3-hour workshop for gosh sakes, right? Which means I at some point lost myself. And I have notes somewhere. And all of a sudden I'm going down a path. Someone asked me a question and I went back to the audience and I said, okay, help me out here. Where was I?
mhm.
It's true. You know, no one wants you to fail. So instead of trying to pretend and going, saying, I think I goofed that one up. Let's try it again. What I meant to say was, and I think those are really fine.
Human moments.
They are. And you see that if you watch enough news, people stumble, it's okay. You get on with that. You know, we were kind of going down that path. Speaking of kind of me losing myself there, I also didn't want to forget one of my other cardinal rules. And that is make sure that you speak like your peeps. And I've said it that way. What I really mean there is speak like your people. A good example is you call it what they call it. It means avoiding the acronyms. So if I remember one of my clients was telling me about his modular office wall design. And I'm going, what? Do you sell cubicles? And he was trying to tell me, we do not call them that in my industry. And I'm thinking, yeah, you do. They're called cubicles. And if you don't call them cubicles, you don't have understanding. And the first level of communication is understanding. So this is something, and I see it all the time, and I know you do too, Maggie, is we see this on pitch decks where people have decided that they're going to put an acronym in, and we have no idea. We are just normal, average people. So we don't know that acronym. We don't know the medical industry. We don't know artificial intelligence. There's 1,000 things we don't know. And you have to think that most of your investors don't know that either.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that they're stupid. It just means that they're not in the weeds in your industry. So what do you think of the whole idea of talking to a 6th grader?
I try to aim a little bit higher, but I used to call that, gosh, when my mother was alive, I called it a mom reviewer. So I used to have my mom review every single blog I wrote. These are old days. But trust me, this did work because if my mother understood it, everybody understood it. But I remember one time I had her read a blog and she told me that I had an error. She said, oh my gosh, Liz, you have an error, a spelling error throughout the entire blog. She says, you kept calling it viral marketing, and I'm sure that you meant vital marketing. So obviously what I learned is I might have and should have and changed it. So I started the blog with, this blog is about viral marketing. In case you haven't heard, it is so contagious. People catch on to it like the flu. And then I went on. Mm-hmm. And in fact, anytime you are doing a pitch, not only have we talked about you have to practice it, you have to be in front of people. Make sure it's in front of people who know nothing about your business. And I think that will probably get you down to either that 6th grader or 6-year-old or 8-year-old. There's also a great thing, and I don't know if you've seen it on Wired magazine. They have a video channel and they explain complicated topics at 5 different levels. So they start with a kindergartner, then they go to a tween, then they go to a high school student, then they go to a college, and then a grad student and an expert. And it's a really interesting exercise. And yours truly watched it on blockchain, because I think I was the 3-year-old's understanding of what blockchain is and how it works. And I figured,
you're an expert?
Oh no, I made it to high school. I didn't have girls to be in high school. But you see where I'm going on this, which is that's important knowledge so that you know if you're finally talking to somebody, right? If you were speaking the same language, one-on-one, maybe with an expert, that's one thing. But your pitch really has to be at that lowest level. In fact, I'm thinking of doing it. I thought it was so brilliant that I'm actually thinking of doing this branding, starting with kindergartner and doing exactly the same thing and seeing if I can challenge myself to convey something which is also kind of obscure to somebody who knows nothing about what I'm talking about. It's going to be interesting.
That's around the whole concept of branding.
Yes.
And you would do it. So this was Wired magazine or Wired online? Where was
Yeah,
that?
yeah. I'll say, if you want, I can send the link and we can certainly follow up. But yeah, it was really, really helpful. And they do it on tons and tons of topics.
Okay, well, that's a good resource.
It was really good. And it was like this. So if we have people listening, and this pains me to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. Because I always believe that you have to practice what you speak. And I have really shared what works when it comes to storytelling and what doesn't work when it comes to storytelling. So I'm going to take the big leap and I am going to tell my origin story. And it has probably 25 errors in it. And I commit every single sin, which I have shared about what not to do when it comes to storytelling. And your challenge, should you decide to accept it, is to use the chat box, or Maggie will be our sounding board, and really see if you can detect why this is such a lousy way to tell a story.
So we're going to try to find each of your 25 errors. What's wrong with this picture? Okay.
Exactly. Because it's just, I mean, you can all day long, I can tell you how to tell a story, and we'll eventually do some one-on-ones, but I think it's important that you really start to get it, so that if you're in the audience or you're practicing your own, I want you to be able to dissect it going, ugh, no, great. Make sense?
Okay. Yep. Everybody ready? I'm watching the chat.
Okay. But let me tell you an interesting story about what I do and why I do it. I do what I do because growing up, I lived in East LA. And all I wanted to do in East LA was look like everybody else. So my big goal was to have stick straight hair parted in the center and to have this beautiful, amazing dark tan. And just in case you missed it, my skin might be a little bit lighter than that. So one day I decided to go up to the roof of my apartment building with a bottle of baby oil and lemon juice and a reflector shield. I went to the top floor and I put baby oil all over my face, lemon juice all over my hair in the hope that it would lighten it, and put out the reflector shield, and I stayed there for 6 hours. When I was finished, I not only didn't have a tan, I had welts and blisters all over my body. When I finally went up to my mom, who was horrified, and she kind of tries to hug me, she couldn't understand what I was doing. She's like, why would you do this? And I said, because I just wanted to be like everybody else. And that's when I knew I had to be a branding expert. It's so horrible. It's so horrible.
Okay, no, so we have some of the errors that were discovered were telling us how to feel about that interesting story.
Correct.
Some people thought it was just too much about you.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody said you were over verbose.
Yeah.
Yeah, too much detail. And the last one I have is that it's a boring story.
It's really boring. And I actually can tell the story. But some other takeaways, and I like the fact that you folks are listening, is it could be more interesting, but also I was also the hero of my own story. When I tell the story the correct way, it's my mother who says to me, Liz, why were you trying to be like everybody else? You were never going to be like everybody else. You get to be you. And my mother had the words of wisdom that inspired me to understand what branding is about.
Garen also says that you didn't start with the intent.
Oh, tell me what he means, if that's about intent.
Well, Garen, you can unmute yourself and join the party here.
I just didn't know where you were going with it. The ending felt so out of touch with the beginning. it's like, I didn't know why I'm listening to you sitting on your roof.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't understand it. That's,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to tell the story, I needed to make sure you really cared, right? You had to understand that I was in two different parts of LA, which is I either tell the story I'm in East LA and therefore, todos mis amigos, all of my friends only spoke Spanish, which you can imagine I did not blend in. Or I skipped straight to high school where now I was in a different high school and everyone was blonde and had a band de soleil tan. And that's also one of the things is when you add some of the details that help people relate, that's better. So if I talk about a band de soleil or my mother opening a jar of Noxzema, if you're from that era or Sun-In for your hair, people start to get it because they recognize the brands. But you're so right in that I have to get it to the point where this is why, and this is why it was pivotal and why I stopped trying to blend in, because the whole purpose, and this goes the other point, when you tell a story, you have to wrap up the purpose of the story with a bow. Make the point, drive the point home. And this is why. So every single story has a purpose. And in fact, if you think about it, you can tell the story and then have 2 or 3 different lessons that it shows. So think of it without, gosh forbid, going down that path. Think of it a little bit like Aesop's fable. There has to be a purpose and a reason why you're sharing the story. And in that horrible way of doing it, I didn't wrap it up in a bow very nicely at all.
I actually didn't know you were done. I thought there was more to the story.
So it just ends. But I'm not crazy, but I have seen and heard people do these sort of stories all the time. I mean, I must hear it all the time. Oh my God, let me tell you a funny story. And all of a sudden we're going, that wasn't that funny. And I also started with, oh my gosh, let me tell you an interesting story, right? Don't get to judge my own story.
You also said something about being concise and cutting it so that it's, to like the bare bones minimum. And it's like really baby oil and lemon juice.
Right. And there's 1,000 things there. And if you tell it right, then maybe you look at things to help hang a story together, right? So if I tell it a little more concise, I might say after 6 hours, I was burned, I was roasted, I was toasted. So just because those 3 words hang together, it makes the story hang together. So something to think about there, but really you have to bring the whole point by, and that's why. There's the founder of, and I don't know if he's here today, but the founder of CareShare tells his origin story. And I think it actually, and I've heard him do it in probably 35 seconds. And this is the best I can imitate it, but I think it goes something like this. I remember in 1984 when my mother turned 80 and we had to put her in an assisted living place, and she was over 2,000 miles apart. And the only updates we got from the assisted living facility was on her medication or if she fell. But what we really wanted to know was, how was she feeling? Is she going to exercise? Is she going to book study? Is she going to Bible study? Is anyone visiting? And I figured out that nobody else, they couldn't share any information because of HIPAA rules. But all our family wanted to know was really what the well-being was. And because she was so isolated and we were so isolated, that's why we created CareShare, a service that tells how the patient is doing and even recommends when someone needs a visitor. But something like, do you see what I mean? But I mean, you understand the little bit of the pain, right? He was far away and you get it. And certainly Chip can do that better. But I think that's an idea of where you still can have it less than a minute, but you get the fact of why he created this, why he created the company. And I like those.
So is a minute a good target if it's part of a pitch?
It's a really good target. And in fact, don't forget, if you're speaking for an hour, you might be able to have 2 minutes, if you're doing 30-minute presentation, you probably get a minute and a half, right? If you're doing a 5-minute pitch, you probably get 30 seconds. And I'm really rigorous about timing. And that's one of those other things that I practice. If I am truly getting good at a pitch, and most of you have some sort of a voice app on your phone you can use, is I will practice, 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 and have it timed. I recently did a speech where I knew I was allotted 2 minutes. And of course, when I finished that speech, my husband turned around and he said, "Oh, 1 minute and 59 seconds." I mean, that was not a guess. It was not because I winged it. It was because I knew exactly what I was going to say. And it's not surprise, therefore, that you do it.
And how
The
many
other thing
times
is-
did you practice that?
That one probably 12 to 20.
12 to 20 times. So, okay.
A 2-minute speech, yes.
So Dave is saying storytelling can allow others to inject themselves into the story. When told well, they feel like they're there. If you wrap the purpose in a bow, do you reduce someone's ability to own the story by co-opting it? Or how can you avoid that?
Yeah, I'm following you here. I like the idea that they can see themselves in the story, that you too might have that issue, but I'm not sure about them co-opting it. One of my pet peeves, by the way, as a speaker, is my own stories have been stolen. I've heard my own stories about my life told by other people. Now that is frustrating. Not kidding. I'll tell you that in just a moment. So I'm not sure if and if you want to unmute yourself so I can understand them better, I think I need a little bit more specifics on what he means by someone co-opting that story.
Go ahead, Dave.
I think when you talk about wrapping it in a bow,
Mhm.
but part of good storytelling and part of, I guess, reading a book as well is being able to use your imagination and going into that space. So when you tell a good story, people relate to it. Life is good, and so maybe that's part of the co-opting, not so much stealing it. But when you wrap everything in a bow, when you define the purpose specifically, do you take away from that imaginative piece or the ability for somebody to just sort of make that story their own and really relate to it? And maybe that's not the purpose of
No, David, it's really valid. But I think there's a big difference between, we're very much here talking about business storytelling, right? So business storytelling, we are trying to lead you down a primrose path. This is the destination we want you to go. We want you to feel this way because we either want you to buy the product, motivate the troops, or give us money. We have reverse engineered the story to hit its objective. So that way it's different. This is not as if I'm telling a story just to motivate people, right? If I'm the Tom Brady and there's a few thousand people and I'm talking about how I'm still brilliant at 42, then that's really different than I want you to think about, what do you want to achieve? What is something that's really bothering you? What is your big goal in life? Do you see the difference? Then I'm fine. I want to inject you. But if I'm really doing business story for a certain different purpose, then I actually trying to keep you out of it. I just want you to feel how I want you to feel so you understand that point of view.
That's a good distinction. Thank you.
Liz, George asks if you've ever been in Toastmasters, and are you currently?
No, if you can believe, I've never been in my life. I've never been in my life. So I can't.
You're familiar with them, though.
I can't. I wrote a book on speaking. I've done I don't even want to guess how many speeches, but no, I've never been to Toastmasters. The only thing I know it makes sense is it makes you practice. And that's the other thing I always know, practice makes perfect. And I will tell you, virtually all of my speaking clients, they will do anything but practice. I've heard every excuse in the book, but and this is how I make sure they practice. Like, good. Send me your MP3 files, even for a 2-minute speech. Send me your MP3 files. Give me 20 takes on this. Show me how you made that smoother. Work with me. And then I know you've really, really practiced.
So you want your clients to send you files 20
Often, yeah.
times practicing their speech?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, that's hard.
It's
Okay.
really hard, but it just, I mean, but let's be real. If you are going in front of you're pitching for what? $250,000? I think that's worth it. If you're out there and there's going to be 5,000 people and that's your target rich client and they're going to hire you, I think that's worth it. And the point is that every time you practice that speech, even if it's for 20 times, you get better you get smoother, you find your rough spots. And you realize, oh, that's not hanging together, or you keep stepping over that line, or you get tongue-tied, change the line.
That's a good point.
Liz, I
So-
do have a question for you,
Sure.
and you said you were going to bring it up. It was regarding having people tell your own stories. I view that as probably the biggest success because your brand has connected. They're telling your story. I view that as a positive.
Well, you're really sweet, but they tell the story as their own. So, George, I was at Quaker Oats a number of years ago, and my goal there was to sell Aunt Jemima pre-mix muffin mix, believe it or not. And one of the people that I pitched to was a guy by the name of Howard Schultz, who was then the CEO of Starbucks. And he told me that Starbucks would never bake on premises because Starbucks had to smell like coffee. And if he baked on premises, it would smell like Cinnabon. That's how much he cared about the aroma of coffee. I didn't get the sale, obviously. Howard Schultz, the world has changed significantly since then. So can you imagine, George, I am sitting at another National Speakers Association and someone tells the story about pitching Howard Schultz. Can you imagine? They hijacked my life. Someone also stole verbatim, my LinkedIn profile. Some branding expert, and I put them side by side. I was furious. It still exists. So that to me is not flattery. I work with 3 distinct audiences, and I made a chart of his LinkedIn profile and my LinkedIn profile, and every single word was stolen. So no, I didn't really feel that one was very, flattery is the greatest. Ooh, what was that? I lost it there. What if flattery is the greatest?
Imitation is the greatest
Thank you.
form of flattery.
Yeah, so no, I didn't feel great about that one.
Yeah, I wouldn't blame you on that one. They were stealing it to profit from it.
Yeah, and as they're all like, oh, that's a cool story about talking about why, the senses are so important when it comes to branding. I'll steal that one. Not such a great idea.
Okay, Liz, you want to put a bow on it? Har har.
Me, would I put a bow on it? To me, really, and I know I get the honor of coming back later and working with some people one-on-one. And to me on this one, the real goal is to make sure your stories are you, they're authentic, they're believable, and they make us care. And I think if we look back in history, we are always looking for that interesting company that brings us a little bit closer. The research right now is that brands that have a story, whether that's Tom's Shoes, for example, or Warby Parker, that these brands that have a story to tell, we care more and we're willing to pay more. And the more that you share your story, the more you're able to spread the word. And to me, the most important, increase your mind share, get you to increase your market share. And that puts you on the right road to profitability.
Thank you very much, Liz. Let's give
You're welcome.
Liz a round of applause by Zoom.